Go into the full session here. So I'm about to hit record and everyone should be hopefully muted. All right, so let's see here, hitting that. Well, welcome everyone to CU122 week number 3. This week we're going to start exploring and moving away a little bit from the bread and from the pâte à choux that we did this last 2 weeks. We're still going to kind of do a little bit of pastry, but we're going to kind of move into the world of savory pastry. So just kind of 2 quick little head notes, or 1 little quick head note before we go into everything. Make sure that if you're watching the live session, that you keep the live session on your screen for the full time, and so that everyone can see you. The other thing is that you want to be able to record it. I know some students have been having some issues with the recording of the live session and getting the green check mark. So please make sure that you keep the live session in your window, and you have to watch for a minimum of 30 minutes. If you just jump on in and click the confirm button, it's not going to confirm. So if you want to have that green check mark, make sure that you go ahead and do that. So any other questions on that? You can raise your hand. Let's see if there's any raised hands on that. And then we're going to move quickly into this week's product. We're going to go over the recipe. We're going to go over that. We're then going to come back and do a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to look at the last couple of weeks in terms of, or last week's pâte à choux. We're going to go over some questions and some issues. You know, we'll talk about, you know, what went well, what didn't go well. We're going to save those questions for later. And then we're going to then kind of leave it up for questions. So if you have any questions just really quickly about moving in, let's see, I think Amanda has one. You can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I know you and I have gone back and forth about the videos. So so I'm on the live one now, of course, watching it. Is there a confirm at the end of this, or do we have to wait until we go into our assignments? Because that's where I'm having the problem, is it's making me like rewatch the whole thing again before I can hit the check mark.
You should be getting it when you're doing the live session now. So when you watch the live session for a minimum of 30 minutes, you should be able to get the confirm and the check mark, not when you're doing the assignment. They're 2 different.
Yeah. Okay, because at the end of last week's, I stayed on for like 15 minutes because I had some questions, but then I must have not seen it or something, but then I had issues with it the whole time. But there should be a confirm button at the very end of our live session.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
I did not know that. I'll look for it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem. Jen? You can unmute yourself, Jen, if you have a question. Let's move over to Lisa, or Lise.
Hi, yes. I was just wondering, it's about the pâte à choux, if we're talking about that now, just real quick.
So we're going to double back.
If it gets too wet. Oh, okay. Gotcha.
We're going to double back to the pâte à choux right after we talk about the empanadas, and we'll spend a little bit more time on that, just so that we can get into this week's recipe. Jen, do you still have a question? If not, I'll go ahead and lower your hand. Okay, I'm going to lower your hand. If you still have a question, you can put it in the chat room. If not, we will talk about it at the end of the session. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up my presentation there. Hopefully everybody can see that. All right, should be coming up. Everyone see that? That looks good. All right, so this week we're going to be working on savory pastry. So we're going to start moving to empanadas. So here we're going to work a little bit with pastry techniques. We're going to learn a little bit about the difference between mealy and flaky pie doughs, make basically a pie dough in one form or another. We're going to learn how to fill that, and we're also going to make a salsa with that. So it's kind of a couple of different components, and it's nice that we're dealing with in a slightly different way than you know, making something that's sweet. So basically, what are empanadas? For all intents and purposes, they're just little hand pies. They originate from Spanish-speaking countries. I used to live in Spain back in the mid-90s, and I remember going to little bars and you know, restaurants, and they would have these on the counter. Sometimes they would be small individual ones. Sometimes they would be a larger portion one. But again, they were often fried. That's often typically how you see them. But again, they would be filled with all sorts of flavorful fillings. typically meats, different vegetables. Very rarely did you see seafood. Occasionally you saw seafood, but more oftentimes it was beef or chicken or vegetables. So it was basically very similar to the kind of Cornish pasty. I don't know if anyone's known in England what a Cornish pasty is, or if you go to Australia, they have meat pies in Australia. So if you look around the world, there's lots of different traditions that have some sort of little meat pie that you can either hold or you can eat out of hand. So here's the recipe. We're going to go in this a little bit more detail and a little bit of substitutions, but it'll be here for those that want to come back to it and see the recipe. It's also linked in our homepage. As you can see, there's not a lot of ingredients. We're going to be using a couple types of flour or veg flour. We're going to be using a fat, in this case, lard or veg shortening, water, salt, and then pepper and Monterey Jack cheese. So they're fairly easy in terms of the amount and quantities of ingredients that you need. So here's a picture of mise en place. We have all the ingredients out there: 2 ounces of bread flour, 1 ounce of cake flour, a 1/2 ounce of lard or shortening, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, a 1/2 ounce, 1 1/2 ounces of water, 1 poblano pepper, roasted, skinned, seeded, and small dice. And we'll go over a second how to do that. 2 ounces of jack cheese and some oil, depending if you're going to be frying these. So I know we've had a bunch of questions already out there about some substitutions. So if you do not have the cake flour, you can substitute the 3 ounces with all AP flour. I would not mix the bread flour and the AP flour. I would go ahead and just use 3 ounces of AP flour. For the fat, you could also use coconut oil in replacement for the lard or the shortening. That's another solid saturated fat that will work very similarly in this pastry and works out very well. And if you don't have jack cheese, you could use a pepper jack cheese, you could use cheddar cheese, you could use Colby. Kind of hard melting cheeses like that in that same category are other good cheeses you can use. So, regionally you can do different things. I actually picked, not for this one because I wanted to make it again, I picked up a smoked jack cheese because I wanted to do it with some smoke flavor. So again, you can alter this a little bit as you go along and start thinking about, creativity and how to do different things in there. So moving on here for step number 1. You're going to go ahead and sift your flour. So if you notice here in this picture, you have the flour on the top that looks a little chunky, and then down on the bottom, it's going to look nice and smooth. Why do we do this? We're going to get rid of lumps. We're going to mix the flours, and it's also easier for mixing. So these are the reasons why you can do this. If you don't have a sifter like this, or some sort of a strainer that you can use as a sifter, you can also whisk your flour. So that would kind of be the second method of kind of mixing this up there. But you want to mix these two, the cake and the bread flour, so they're evenly mixed. So step number 2 is you're going to add the lard or your shortening or the coconut oil that you're using, and you're going to blend it thoroughly with the flour. So here, I just literally took a spatula at the very beginning, and then I mixed it in until that fat was kind of coated with the flour. And then I just went in with my hands and just started, kind of like biscuit method. You pick up a little in your hands and you kind of squeeze it with your hands to kind of dissipate that fat or coat the flour with all the fat. And that's essentially what we want to do, is because we want to go ahead and shorten gluten. We've talked the last couple of weeks about gluten and bread. It developed these big kind of sheets. In pâte à choux, we also want to develop gluten to trap the steam so it would rise. In this case, we want to develop gluten to kind of be small kind of pieces. We don't want to develop necessarily huge sheets of it. So that's the reason why we're cutting this in here completely. And what this does is it shortens gluten development. And that's why shortening is called shortening, for no other reason that in the baking world, it shortens gluten. So that's the reason why we do it there. And it makes for a nice tender pastry crust. So here I have a picture of lard in the background, and you can use lard. If lard is available, lard is just rendered pig fat. If you do find lard, one of the best forms of lard to use is called leaf lard. And if you see that, connotation and when you're buying it, sometimes it's a little more expensive, but it's particularly the fat that comes around the kidneys and the liver and the internal organs on the inside. That fat melts differently than lard, let's say, taken from like the fat back or the belly of the pig. So it's a specific type lard. And a lot of aficionados of pie making, that is the type of lard that they kind of esteem for in terms of their pies. So sometimes if you're a great pie maker or you're reading recipes about pies, they often will use lard for that. So moving on over here, you're looking at the texture here. Again, it's going to be kind of pebbly. I have a little close up with my hand here. It kind of has like a sandy, slightly greasy texture. And if I squeeze it with my hand, it kind of like holds together, but then falls apart. So here you want the fat completely blended in with the flour in total. So here's some things that you might find for lard. So there's an example of a pig lard. This I think comes from Chicago. If you're near a grocery store, you might find a Goya lard. Here's labeled lard, or sometimes it's labeled as manteca. Both of these are hydrogenated. If you look on the label there, it says hydrogenated. This is a step in process that kind of makes that product more shelf stable and adds a little bit more hydrogen in it. You can use that product or you can use a vegetable shortening. And so another kind of important thing is to here notice what the difference between a fat and an oil is. So generally fats, when we talk about them in culinary terms, they're generally solid at room temperature. They generally come from animal origin, and they're generally saturated. And very basically, that means the carbon chains that make up the fat have hydrogen completely attached to it. So they're completely saturated with hydrogen. Now, if you look at oils, generally oils are liquid at room temperature, except for coconut and palm oil, at least in our temperate climate. If you go down to the tropics, they're going to be liquid at room temperature. But here in our temperate climates, they're a little bit more solid. Generally, they're from vegetable origin. So, you know, your corn, your soybean, your we can talk another time where canola comes from, but again, originate from the vegetable kingdom, and generally they're unsaturated. So they have points on their carbon chain where hydrogen is not attached. So that's when we talk about fats and oils. When we make pastries, when we're dealing with pie dough, we want to deal with fats, not generally oils, because fats are able to coat the fat more, or the flour more evenly compared to oils. So moving on over here. So then we have our completely coated fat or flour. Now we're going to go ahead and start mixing in our water. So here you're going to dissolve the salt in the water. The water should be slightly warm for this to happen. So you want to go ahead and stir it so it's completely dissolved. And then you're going to pour it completely over your blended flour there. You're going to go ahead and mix that with a spatula. And then the next important part is oftentimes this is kind of overlooked in sometimes making pastries, is a French term called froissage. Kind of sounds like a massage, but it's froissage. So if you see my hand in the picture in the background here, you basically take this mass of dough and you just kind of push it to the other side of your work surface with the heel of your hand, kind of flattening it as you go. And as you do that, you kind of accentuate that kind of flakiness, or the uncoated flour that's now mixing with the water creates these nice flakes that you're able to kind of push there. Once you get that, I do that kind of 2 or 3 times, it starts coming together as a ball, and then I kneaded it for 5 minutes until I got to this nice smooth texture here. So this is what we're looking for. We want to have that nice gluten development. It should look nice and smooth rather than the shagginess over here. Now, if we're making flaky pie dough, we're not making pie dough in this class, but if you were making flaky pie dough, you don't want to go to this complete stage here where it's completely smooth. So this is what's called mealy pie dough. So here we have a parchment paper lesson. So here is just kind of a breakdown, kind of looking microscopically, at least with our kind of observational chef eyes, of what's happening inside of our product. So if you look over on the left-hand side over here, at least my left-hand side, I'm not sure if you see it on your right-hand side, this is what we refer to as flaky pie dough. So you see it's going to be a mixture of gluten sheets and shortened gluten. So what we were just making or describing a second ago was shortened gluten, where we take the fat and we completely envelop our flour so it's completely shortened. Where gluten sheets are what activated by water. So it's any flour that has not been coated with fat is allowed to form these larger gluten sheets. So in a flaky pie dough, you're kind of having a mixture between short and long. And just remember this when we get to biscuits later on in the class, because this is going to be very similar to what we're looking for in a biscuit, versus our mealy pie dough, where we have it more uniform, and then the shortened gluten strands forms a different matrix in there. So what do we do here? Flaky pie dough, you coat some of the flour with fat. Mealy pie dough, we coat all of the flour with fat. In flaky pie dough, we add the water slowly. In mealy pie dough, we add it all at once like we just did. With both of them, we do that technique of frissage, where we go ahead and use our heel of our hand to push the dough from one side of the surface to the other. Minimal kneading for flaky pie dough. For the mealy pie dough, you want to go ahead and knead it a little bit more. So what are some of the results? Okay, flaky pie dough is going to be a little bit harder to handle. So when you want to make sure that you keep it completely cold, so when you go out and roll it and form it, it can still kind of fray along the edges and look kind of funky. So you want to make sure that it's cold when you're dealing with it. Mealy pie dough is better for wetter items, so basically more leak proof. So if you're doing something that has a more liquidy filling or frying something, you want to use a more mealy pie dough because you don't want that liquid to kind of either saturate in or come out of the product. And the other thing about mealy pie dough is it's generally easier to roll because you've shortened that, the gluten strands, you've mixed everything completely in there. It's generally an easier thing to knead. So now that we got our pie dough, we got our empanada dough, we have it resting now for 30 minutes. So after you do that process, it's really important that you let it rest. We're now going to go ahead and combine our cheese and our roasted peppers. So here in this slide, I'm just showing you a technique for roasting peppers. There's a couple of different ways to do it. I like to take my peppers over, I have a small wire rack. It's kind of a quarter sheet pan rack, and I put it directly over a flame, and I just here wash my poblano peppers. Make sure you always wash your vegetables before doing anything with them. And then I just slowly rotate them using a pair of tongs until I get a nice kind of burnt look on the outside. Basically, this is helping us give flavor, but also importantly, it's helping us to remove the skin. The skin on like a poblano pepper tends to be very tough, and so that you want to kind of get the flavor of the inside, but we want to remove the skin on the outside. So after I get a nice even char, sometimes you have to rotate it in different directions, turn it on its end so it can kind of char on the top end. I put it in a bowl, and then I cover it. The important part of this is you're going to steam a little bit. Now with poblano peppers, they are a very thin pepper. And if you were doing this with like a bell pepper, you maybe want to put plastic wrap over the top of this. Try to just put something loose over the top of it, because if you trap too much heat inside of that bowl, what's going to happen is that pepper is going to get way too mushy. And when you go to dice it, you're just going to have mush. So you just want to have a little bit of steam, not too much steam. The next step is you want to go ahead and remove the skin on that pepper. I've seen some people go over right to the sink, put the pepper under the water, and then just start washing all of the skin off. You're also washing off a lot of your charred flavor. So there's two ways you can do it. You can put it on your cutting board and then kind of scrape the charred skin off. I like using a bowl of water. So if you see in this picture here, I have a bowl of water, and I just fill it up with some water. I then remove any skin, charred skin with my hand from the poblano, and then I dip my hand into the water, and that gets off all the char on my hand, and then I repeat that until I get the char. I then open it up, and then I use my knife, if you notice in this last picture over here, to kind of gently scrape the inside to remove any of the seeds. Now that you have that bowl with all those chunkies in it, you can use your strainer, strain out all those chunkies, and then you don't have all that stuff in your sink. So I think sometimes people do it under the sink because they think it's fast, but then you have tons of junk inside your sink that you have to clean up. So you want to often think about that as well. And here we're only doing one. I mean, you might be working in a production-based kitchen and you might have to roast off a whole case of peppers. So in that case, you want to think about ways that are going to improve your production as well.
Okay, let
So
me really quick, Chef.
Yep.
I do have a couple of questions, actually quite a few in the chat about if they have a electric stove.
Okay.
What would your suggestions be? I would suggest if you have an outdoor grill to do it there. That's what I did because I do have an electric stove, unfortunately. So I did mine on my grill. You can also roast them inside the oven. And you can use your broiler if you would like to. Just be very gentle and very careful with that because it will toast them very quickly. Do you have any other suggestions?
I put them on this slide here. I forgot to mention that. I'm sorry. But yeah, you can roast them over a flame on a wire rack under a broiler. If you do it under the broiler, you have to rotate it. Some people also cut it in half. And so they kind of have the two halves under the broiler and they put it underneath there. You could also do it in a 450-degree oven. Just be careful with the poblanos there. You may not get as much charring on the outside. And you kind of want to get it to the point where you can remove the skin, but the flesh doesn't become mushy. Some people also coat the poblano or any pepper with a little bit of oil. I personally don't like the oil. I find it's a little bit harder to remove the skin. If you're doing it in the 450-degree oven, that actually might make the skin come off a little bit easier, but you may not have as much kind of charring on the outside. So those are some different techniques. And I didn't put up there the gas grill. If you have a gas grill or a charcoal grill, those would also work if you just have an electric grill.
And then I also had somebody mention a torch. Now, remember, a torching is just going to blister the outside. and it's just going to blister the skin. It's not going to actually roast the pepper itself and make it soft or make it more flavorful. Okay, so the torch is really just going to attack the skin.
Yeah, and I have seen some chefs do that. I've seen some videos of people doing that. I don't necessarily recommend it. I like, again, like Chef Jen is saying, I like the flavor of that char that you get from putting it directly over a flame or under a broiler. An electric broiler will also work fine too. Was that the only one? Other question? Okay. All right, so let's see, moving forward. So now that we have our cheese mixture, so we take those poblanos, the background picture over here, you're just gonna take your shredded cheese. After you clean your poblano peppers, you're gonna make your julienne strips, then you're gonna make your small dice, and then you're just gonna mix your poblanos and the cheese. So that's the filling that's gonna go on the inside. It's super easy, 2 ingredients. So now we're gonna move on over to actually forming the empanadas. So now that you've have this dough that's relaxed for at least 30 minutes, you're gonna wanna go ahead and divide it. Now, recipe calls for dividing it in 8 portions. What you see me here doing, and I did this recipe ×3, but you can still do this with the recipe ×1. This is a technique I learned by making dumplings. You basically make a round, the ball is like this. You make a hole in the middle, you kind of stretch it out kind of like you would a bagel, so it kind of looks like a donut in a way, and then you cut it in half on either side. And then that way you're able to now, if you're doing 8, each half of those is gonna do 4. It's kind of not unlike, anyone who's ever been to like a sushi restaurant before and see someone cut sushi, like a sushi roll, cut one in half and then they put 2 together and then they cut them in half again. It's kind of that same idea. You want to try to get it as uniform as possible. You don't want to be cutting this up and putting it on a scale and making it exact that way, because then you're going to end up with all these small pieces that don't come together. So this is, again, a technique I learned from dumpling making. So you make a hole, you then cut it in half, you have each of your logs on either side, and then rolling them off. And then because you guys are going to be doing 4 per, you would just cut it, in half, and then, each half and half again. So that's going to make 4 pieces. So if you cut this in half this way, and then cut it over here, and then over here, you're going to have 8 distinct pieces that you can work with. Once you have these 8 pieces, you're going to want to make a little ball again. So not unlike we did when we were making the French bread, you want to kind of roll it in on itself, make kind of a nice gluten sheet on the outside, roll it up a little bit, and then put it on your surface. Now, important here, you need to let this rest again for about another 15 to 30 minutes. If you take this and you would immediately make it and you try to roll it out, it's going to want to fight back. Most of the flour in here is bread flour. So this is kind of like, gluten central. It's going to want to spring back. You try to roll it out, you're going to be fighting and tearing with it. So let it relax for about 15 to 30 minutes, and you're going to have a much better job at rolling that out. Is there any questions in the chat about that? I think there's one. Anthony? Salamone?
How you doing today?
Hey, great. How you doing?
Good. I just wanted to ask, do I have to use the peppers in it? Because nobody really eats peppers here in my house.
Well, you don't, if we were talking about this before, instead of poblano peppers, if you wanted to do something like just a bell pepper, and maybe put a little, if you needed a little spiciness in there, a little jalapeno, or you can just do it with
I
the
wouldn't
bell
say
pepper.
no peppers at all.
The key there is that you're kind of learning the technique of also roasting the pepper, and learning that technique as well. So, you're more than welcome to make the dough and put other fillings in it if you've fulfilled the class requirements. But I think for the class requirements, I think, trying to stick with a pepper would be the number one. If you can't do that, then you can talk with us offline, and each one of us chefs, we can figure out a plan for you individually.
Because I really don't eat peppers at all. That's why I don't like peppers. So if I make it, I won't be able to eat it. And I like to eat the stuff I make.
Okay, so let me suggest 2 things. One, for you, sir, if you really, we need you to learn that technique. So what I would suggest is doing 1 or 2 of the empanadas with a pepper. So roast 1 pepper off so you know how to do it, and it's been done and you've met the requirement, and then put whatever you want in the other ones and use those as the photos as well. That way we can see that you've done different types, but at least do 1 pepper so that we can see that you know how to roast it.
Okay. I can use bell peppers, right?
You can do a bell pepper if you want. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. I get my mom eats a little bit of peppers, but she don't like all the peppers. So let me see what kind she likes. So at least because I don't like wasting food.
Absolutely, for
Yeah.
sure.
Like I'm big into not wasting food.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good idea. But make sure we're always doing the requirements as well as the class. I think that's the other key thing as well.
Okay. Usually I do. That's why I was just asking about the peppers, so I can
That's
try
fine.
and see what I can do about that.
All right, and we have one
That's a
more
great-
question about lactose-free cheese. You can use vegan shredded cheese for this. Yes, you can.
Yeah, that's not a difference in technique.
No.
You're just shredding a block of coagulated protein and putting it in there and melting. So technique-wise, that's absolutely fine. All right, so moving on, unless there's questions about forming. Is there any questions about forming? Okay. Now moving on over here. So these are steps 8, 9, and 10 in the recipe. You're gonna have your relaxed dough. You're gonna put it on your work surface. You might have to have a little bit of flour. I wouldn't put a lot of flour because you don't wanna dry this out too much. You're then going to roll it out. So notice I have the rolling pin from what I call the 9 o'clock to the 3 o'clock position. And I take that rolling pin and I move it towards the 12 o'clock position. So if you think of your little dough ball there as a clock, I then take what is the current 12 o'clock position and I move it to the 9 o'clock position, and then I repeat that. If you do that and constantly move it, you're going to have a nice, maintain that roundness to your ball that you're rolling out there. So again, from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock, I'm always keeping my hand in the same direction, and I'm always moving from 12 to 9, 12 to 9. So these are just some cues that I use when I'm doing it just to try to keep it round. And I do this with pie dough as well. You can do this with a big one or a small one, so it's the same technique. So here we're gonna roll it out to about 4 inches. That's the diameter that we're looking for. Sometimes I go just a tiny bit more because as you put the filling and hold it, you'll notice that everything kind of wants to shrink just a tiny little bit. Here I put the dough on a bench scraper and put it on my scale because I just wanted to measure so I could have a visual cue what 20 grams was like, or about half an ounce. So you can see right over here. I thought it's a little bit too much filling. So if I were doing this over again, I would probably go down to about 17 or 18 grams just because some of the filling came out of the filling. So again, about a half an ounce, maybe a little bit less than 20 grams. And again, you're going to put a little bit of water on the outside. So you're just gonna have a pastry brush, a little container of water. You're gonna brush some water along the edges. You're gonna fold this over, and then you're gonna use a knife and a fork, and you're gonna go ahead and crimp the edges and seal it. So you can see that here in the close-up with these pictures. Now I also have this top over here, and I just wanted to show you, it's a little bit harder to kind of zoom in on there. The fork kind of poked in a little bit to the wall of the empanada. You just want to be careful with that because if you poke that wall a little bit as you're crimping it, what happens is some of that filling as it's cooking, especially because this is a lot of cheese, it's going to want to poke out. So you want to just be careful of not making too many holes there. And then decoratively, I've just done this with empanadas for years. I just take the tines of the fork and I make tiny little prick marks on the top. I just think it makes it decoratively, it looks pretty. It's not something that you have to do. But it's just something that I've done years for empanadas just because I like the look of that. Any questions at all about the forming over there? I think there's one from Jose.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
When we're rolling them out, can we use a tortilla press instead of a rolling pin?
If you do have a tortilla press, you can try it, but I really, really want you to try to roll it out because the technique here is to learning to do this rolling process. And while using a tortilla press is great, it doesn't necessarily help you with that rolling process. So try to roll it. Try to do it with the tortilla press. Quite honestly, I sometimes find tortilla presses just as much cumbersome because you're going to have to put a piece of plastic down on top, a piece of plastic on top of it, sandwiching it in there and then taking it off. Sometimes I find the dough sticks a bunch to the plastic. So you might have to play around with the tortilla press, but I would push you and urge you to try to roll it out just to practice the technique.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? No. All right, so I'm going to move on here now to step number 11. We're almost to eating. So now you want to go ahead and bake the items. The recipe calls for baking it at 375 degrees in an oven to golden brown and delicious. I found in my oven it took me about 35 minutes to reach to that. or you can fry it in oil between 350 and 375 degrees. And so I did both of the steps there. So you can see that here's a picture of the ones frying. The picture in the background were ones that were put in the oven. And then I also brushed egg wash on half of them, and I sprinkled them with a little bit of salt and paprika. So if you notice, the ones over here on the right-hand side of this tray were coated with a little bit of egg wash, where the ones on the left-hand side were left without anything. These are what the egg wash ones look before I put them in. So it's up to you. If you want to put a little egg wash, it's going to make it a little bit darker in color. I kind of like that caramelized look versus this over here. Just realize that there's a lot of cheese in there, so the cheese could tend to kind of like poke out a little bit. So that's why I like putting this egg wash in there, so you can get the browning before the cheese kind of completely dissipates. Any questions? I don't see any questions there. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next picture over here. Here's some other pictures of empanadas folded over. Here's some that Chef Jen did. She also used some egg wash over here as well, and some paprika, and we did this independent of each other. It's kind of funny that we're like, no, we need something on top. And so these are just some different ways of doing it. I don't know if you want to talk, Chef, a second about any particular techniques you did in folding these over.
Sure. So when I fold them over, I use my pinkies, and I fold the dough over, and then I take my pinkies and I press downward against the filling, because that gives me that perfect kind of line right there on that filling that you see before I crimp it. And it gets all the air out without putting too much pressure on the dough. That way it doesn't actually break the dough, because some of the peppers might push through the dough if you press down too hard on it. And you don't want flat ones, right? You want it to be nice and domed. So I always just use my pinkies and kind of press it in a little bit. And then when you use your fork to crimp it, I would also suggest, if you have a pizza cutter or a pastry cutter or anything like that, or even a really sharp paring knife, you can actually, after it's pressed, go around and just trim that little edge so it looks really, really even. See how it looks like I have these perfectly even? Yeah, they were not perfectly even until I trimmed them. And that's how you get that like really, really nice curvature and look at the end.
Excellent points. Thank you, Chef. And we're going to now move on over to the salsa verde. So the salsa verde is a very popular Mexican dish, oftentimes served with all sorts of different kind of meats, with grilled items, in this case, empanadas. It can also just go well with chips. So its base is an ingredient called tomatillos, and tomatillos are in the gooseberry family. They kind of look like a tomato, but they're not related to a tomato. They kind of have a husk on the outside of them, and they kind of look like a yellow or a green tomato on the inside. Sometimes between that outer layer on the inside, it can get a little sticky, especially if you have them fresh or you pick them out of your garden. So I know we'll go over a second on subs on the tomatillos. So you're going to be having tomatillos, some onion, some garlic, some jalapeno or some green chilies like serrano, some cilantro, some lime. You're going to use some vegetable oil, and then for the seasoning. So not a lot of ingredients, but I know that some people have been having some problems finding the tomatillos. So very simply, you're going to take your tomatillos, you're going to take all the ingredients, you're going to put them into a food processor or a blender. In my case, I actually used a stick blender. I put everything inside of a quart jar, and I used a stick blender to do it. I personally don't like to have it super smooth. I like to leave some chunkies in it. So you can decide on the blending consistency of what you like. You're then going to take this mixture into a pot. You're going to heat up your oil for the recipe. You're going to, once the oil is hot, you're going to put all of your salsa verde in there, and then you're going to warm up the salsa verde until it's thickened. It just takes a couple of minutes. Once it comes to a simmer, it doesn't take that long. You're then going to taste it for salt. You're going to cool it down, and then you're going to store it. So if you are, so for substitutions, if the only thing you can get are fresh tomatillos, what you can do is you're going to husk them. So you're going to remove that outer shell on the outside. Make sure to wash them because they can get very sticky, or sometimes bugs that come inside the shell kind of stick to the inside. So make sure to wash them. And then you can cook them in different ways. You can boil them. You can roast them, you can grill them, or you can broil them. In either case, you want to cook them until they're tender. Obviously, roasting or grilling and broiling are going to give a little bit more flavor than boiling, but they're just different. There's not necessarily a right or wrong there. Or in my case, the only thing that I could find was tomatillo puree. And so I used tomatillo puree and made sure that I used the 13 ounces that the recipe called for. So you can use any of those substitutions if you couldn't find the regular tomatillos. I just think there's a hand up
You have a
there.
question from Amanda.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, can we, or is it okay if we roast our jalapenos and serranos or whatever other peppers we're using just so it has that charred flavor like the rest of it?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to, it really calls for a very small amount of jalapeno in this recipe. So if you wanted to go ahead and roast that up with the poblano that you're doing, I don't see any problem with that. That's just going to add, you know, a kind of a roasty, toasty flavor. And again, like if you're using tomatillos, fresh ones, then you're going to be already doing that anyway. So that's fine. And you could do that with the garlic. Quite honestly, on a lot of Mexican recipes, they kind of put all those ingredients like on a pan and they put it on a comal. A comal is basically like a griddle, griddle, and they would put all that, the garlic, the onion, the tomatillo, right there to get the char color, then take it off and puree it. Or if they're doing something with tomatoes, they would do the same thing with tomatoes. So I think that would be absolutely fine.
Oh yeah, and that sounds good. So I have black garlic. Would that work as well, or should I stick with regular?
I would just stick with regular garlic. Black garlic is a completely different flavor profile and consistency than normal.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions there on ingredients or technique or substitutes for the salsa verde? Okay, and right here is a great plate up that Chef Jennifer provided for us with our empanadas, a little bit of, I don't know, what did you have there on the bottom? Was that a vegan sour cream?
No, so that's actually a crema.
Crema.
So I'm allergic to dairy, but my family's not. So I used a crema
Okay.
because I'm not a big fan of sour cream anyway. So I made a quick crema with a little bit of ancho chili powder. And then I did these leaves here are actually curry leaves that I fried just to get a little bit more of an earthy flavor added there. I used the salsa that we had, and I did little supremes of the lime, so it would add a little bit of acid. Very, very simple plate, but it looks like it would be a nice little appetizer or a nice little, I don't know, tapa.
Yeah, looks great. So that's a great presentation that you can do, or you can put it on a platter. Be a little creative with how you want to present it.
So I really like to see, especially at this point in our world, we definitely want to see you plating things as if you were going to send it out to your customers, getting a little bit creative, really getting in there and trying new techniques. Try, you know, splatters, try swooshes, try using your spoons, try all different kinds of things and really get in there and try to make it look creative and beautiful. Okay, try to get whimsical with it if you want. And it doesn't take any extra time, right? But it's definitely going to help you, especially in your next class, because that next class, you're going to have to plate everything as if you were sending it out.
Great question. So do we want to move on? We're going to move on now. Does anyone else have questions at all about the empanadas or the salsa verde before we start talking about last week? Yes.
Real quick, Alita actually asked something in the chat about tomatillos and doing a concasse. So concasse, I'm sure you guys learned about, but concasse is when you take your tomatoes and you make a little X on the end. You put it into the boiling water for 15 seconds or so. It releases the peel. No, you don't. You're not going to be doing that for the tomatillos. The skin on the tomatillos is not like the tomato, so you're not going to need to do that. If you're going to cook them by boiling them, you're going to boil them until they get soft. But I would actually suggest that you roast them or use a griddle plate or, you know, use a plancha, a flat top area, use something like that.
Marlon.
Hello.
Hi.
So when we're making the dough for the empanadas, does seasoning do anything to the process of making the dough? Like if I wanted to put like, I don't know, I use Sazón seasoning a lot. So would that change anything about making the dough?
I mean, it's going to change the color. It's going to definitely change the salt because Sazón it's very salty, and also it has a lot of MSG. I mean, salt will inhibit or change the structure of gluten just a little bit. It probably in the end is not going to be super, super changing. It's going to change the flavor though.
Okay.
So, I mean, you might want to play around with it and, put it into, another batch. But sazon in dough could be a little bit tricky. You just want to be careful with the amount that you use just because it is so salty.
Okay. Second question I have is, for our weekly skills practice, can we make different empanadas besides the ones that we're supposed to for class for them?
I mean, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
The other thing too, if you are looking, and this comes, being Puerto Rican, I remember my grandmother having a, big vat of achiote. So that's basically oil with the annatto seed on the shelf, and that would go into everything. So same thing with the manteca. I mean, I've known people, if you look in the old, cookbooks from Puerto Rico, they would just take the lard, heat it up with the achiote seeds, and then take it out. The base color of sazon is the achiote seeds. So you could, if you wanted to have color in the dough, kind of have that orangey red color for what you're looking for, you could always color your oil, your lard, with the annatto seeds,
Okay.
and then use it that way. The sazon kind of takes it a little bit further by adding the salt, the MSG, the red color, the yellow color, and also the other flavoring. So that would be another way to add the color that's creative.
Okay. Last one. It was just something I noticed. Why wasn't this recipe in the metric system like the class 2 were?
In the what system?
Metric, like grams. It's in ounces this week. Is that just because? I don't know.
I don't know. There's been some changes to the curriculum over from the last term to this term. So this was this week's kind of recipes were new. I think they were just recently developed. I'm not sure if there was a conscious decision to keep British Imperial versus grams. It's also good to know both. I mean, that's part of the education process, is to kind of learn both of them. In this case, it's kind of going towards the savory side. I assume that the individual chef that made this just did it in ounces and it made sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Just don't forget though on your scales to switch your units. So that's just the most important thing, the number you're going to read to, but just make sure you hit the units and it's going to say LB or LBOZ or OZ, depending on your scale. Everyone's scale is going to be a little different, but make sure you do that part and zero it out and do all the other steps. And then the measuring should be easy. Good question. Anyone else have questions in terms of that? All right, so we're going to move on over now to pâte à choux. So most of you have already handed in your pâte à choux from last week. We're in the process of evaluating and looking at them. And I would say overall, we had some great submissions. I know a lot of people struggled with pâte à choux. There's a lot of components from last week's dish. Each individual one and then putting them all together. So I know that some people spent a lot of time in organizing and putting it all together, and then they had pâte à choux. I'd probably say the biggest across the board kind of comment that I've seen is that it came out too runny, that it was too liquidy and too soft. And so there could have been a couple of reasons for that. It could go back to the scaling, which we just talked about, making sure that you scale all the rest of the ingredients. I know the base recipe uses bread flour. If some people used AP flour, it could have come out slightly different. But I think a lot of the issues might come down to the scaling. The next thing is you have to make sure to remove enough liquid from the pâte à choux as you're stirring it. And so what you really need to do is make sure you get that kind of floury residue in the bottom of the pan. And then the third thing is I noticed a lot of people in their mise en place were having 3 or more eggs going into their pâte à choux. And I believe the base recipe only called for 155 grams of eggs, which is a little bit less than 3 eggs because each egg is about close to 2 ounces, which is about 56, 57 grams. So if you have 3 eggs, it's going to be close to like 175, 180 grams. So that third egg, as I noticed some people were putting in, more than even 3 eggs. So really important to make sure that you have those measurements properly. So those would be kind of the areas that I would say that the buckets that I would see kind of, to consider if you're approaching the pâte à choux again, or if you're thinking about resubmitting it for next week. I see a couple of questions.
Excuse me, sir, when you had gave me my feedback, you thought I had used all those eggs. No, I used 2.5 dozen, keep starting over
Oh, wow.
because I couldn't, I'm not a baker. I couldn't get it. So I went through 2.5 dozen of eggs just trying to get 4 of these little cakes. So.
And I hear the frustration. So again, I want to make sure that, let's go back to what I was mentioning before, the measuring. So we want to make sure that our scales are set to the right units, that we're doing everything to the right units, that we're tearing things out. And I think that's kind of the most important step there. And then not putting too many eggs in once we've got the pâte à choux to that kind of thick consistency where it's starchy on the bottom of the pan. So that was the point that I've mentioned to, I don't know if it was you, I've been looking at a lot of grading today, and it's kind of across the board. So that would probably be my one comment, is that people they got to that starchy quality, and then when they showed me the sheeting action, it literally came off. So that kind of tells me from here to here, too many eggs were added. So just make sure that the eggs that you measure are 155 grams. So that's what you're adding into the pâte à choux. If at that point, the pâte à choux isn't coming off of your paddle, or if it's not coming off of your spoon, then you can add a little bit more egg. So one tip that I did give people is weigh out the 2 eggs, and then for the 3rd egg, beat it just a little bit so that when you're adding it to the other one, you have a good mixture between yolk and white. Because if that 3rd egg, you just dump it in there, probably what's just going to come out as white, because all the yolk is going to stay in the, whatever you're measuring that egg in. So that would be something to do. So really you're kind of adding, 2.5 eggs about into this recipe, give or take, depending on the size of your eggs. But go by the weight, the 155 grams. Double check all of your math, double check your weights on your scales. Make sure you're tearing between each of the containers, because that's probably the point where I see a lot of people, they put something on their scale, they hit tear, they take that container off, put something on, and then start measuring again. You have to make sure that you hit that tear or 0 button between every time you put a container on. That makes sense? Okay. All right. I think we have a raised hand over here, and sorry, I have to see if Alita or Letta?
Alita, you're right. How you doing, Chef?
Good. How you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. I had a serious problem with the pâte à choux. Okay. Actually, I got married Saturday.
Well, congratulations.
So I started my assignment on Monday, and then, I think that someone brought this to our attention before, the videos that you have under our research material, and then the recipes are totally different. So I normally go by the videos because I like to watch them. I think they're more accurate. I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but I had a problem myself. I did practice the night before, the day after my wedding. I was in the kitchen, and they came out flat. But then I think it was because of the eggs too. Now in the video, she had 9 eggs inside of a container.
Mm-hmm. Well,
okay.
So the recipe that you guys are making, it's the same technique. It's just
right.
scaled down a little bit less so that it was easier for people and home cooks to make it. And so the recipe that was on the video was a larger batch done in a stand mixer. So, again, trying to make sure that people didn't produce too much. They just it's the same recipe. It just scaled back to a little bit less.
Right. So I did use a stand mixer myself. It came out a lot better, a whole lot better the next day, because I didn't even show that batch that I did the first time. I just stopped taking pictures and started it over. And then I couldn't get anything to upload in my pictures. So I had to call technical support like 15 times and I just submitted mine today. And it's 9 hours late. And I was going through these serious problems. So I don't know about the uploading or whatever, but technical support was not a big help. I need to let you know that now. But again, I find that the videos are a lot more effective than the recipe itself, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
I kind of like that a lot more, than this, I'm feeling.
Just remember that the recipe, though, is going to be the amounts that you need to. You can follow the technique from the video, but sometimes the videos and the recipes, the amounts might be slightly different just because they might have been scaled down so that you don't produce too much. That's the only difference. It's
Well,
a simple
it still produced too much. It's just me and my husband. So we have no kids, you know what I mean? So I have all this extra chocolate in my refrigerator now. I did love it. They came out perfect to me so far. He loved them and my grandkids did too. But I think that it was amazing. I'm not a baker, I'm a cook. But for me, I think that.
Pâte à choux is savory. Pâte à choux doesn't necessarily have to be sweet. Pâte à choux, you can mix cheese in it. You can put other fillings in it. It doesn't have to be eclair. So that's why it's kind of like, yeah, we're doing it in a classic sweet application, but the technique you can use for all sorts of different things. I've used pâte à choux for lots of savory applications that had nothing to do with sweets.
Right, but it just came out after the third time around. It came out perfect because they did not flatten, they puffed up. Mm-hmm. So I put those pictures in, but I just had a problem with making that straight line with it, you know, squeezing it out of the bag. Other than that, I think I did very well. Very good. I'm not a baker, like I said, but thank you so much for even showing me that technique.
I think piping is kind of like, I don't know if everyone remembers the Karate Kid movies. You know, wax on, wax off. Right. One of those things that you just do it and do it and do it. And then one day you're not thinking about it and it just comes out. So part of it is, I don't know how else, is just not thinking about it, but doing it. I don't know how else. You have to think about it to the point till you get there. But at a certain point after the piping, it's just like you're piping, and it becomes like muscle memory. You become confident and you're squeezing at the same time, not being tentative. So some people's pâte à choux, when they squeeze and then stop and then pull and then squeeze and stop and pull, it kind of changes shape. So it's kind of having that comfort level. It's kind of the same thing if you've ever been to the Dairy Queen and someone like do one of the squeezes underneath there and it looks all nice and perfect. Well, if I were to go up there and do that immediately, I'd probably make it look like really crazy because I'm not familiar with it and having that touch. It's just, it's part of it is just having that piping bag in your hand, trying it over and over again. That's going to improve it. So pâte à choux is great because it's really not that expensive. And the ingredients aren't expensive and you can just put them in the freezer if you want to. Like you can mix it with cheese, make a nice brugere, take them off and then put them in the freezer. So there's lots of different things that you can do with pâte à choux.
I think that I found out better that when I didn't have to do the piping because I'm in a class, I was better at that. But then when I had to show it and actually do it on camera and, you know, take all these pictures, it really kind of messed me up. So other than that, just like I said, in everyday life, it happens for me, but having to do it now in a class is kind of crazy.
Well, good. I'm glad it finally came out well for you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. All right, I think Jen is up next there. Jen, you want to unmute yourself?
There. Hi. So mine came out pretty good. I was pretty happy with the way the final plating of it and everything. I have a lot of ducks, and I use duck eggs, and I always find that everything I make is richer.
Yeah. Well, duck eggs have a little more fat than they do.
Yeah, it seemed to work better for me. And plus, when I was piping, I found myself holding my breath. To get a straight line.
Yeah. The other thing too that I found with piping is that oftentimes even on the video, everyone is kind of doing it straight on. When I set up my lines on my sheet pan, I do them a little bit on a diagonal. So I kind of start in the corner of the pan and then come in this way because it feels more natural for my hand motion versus going like this. If I'm piping like this, I have a kind of a crink in my wrist. If I do it in an angle, my wrist is at a more natural position. So over time that I've just started piping when I do pâte à choux, when I do cream puffs, when I'm doing, what's it called? Any cookies or piping anything out onto a sheet pan, I often stagger it from an angle rather than a sheet pan directly on, just because my angle of my hand and my wrist is more even this way than like this. This would be straight on, this would be at an angle, so it's kind of a little bit more natural that way.
Okay, yeah, because you noted that I didn't do my tails, but I did, maybe I didn't put it down far enough for, I think 2 of them looked like they had a little tail and the rest were smooth.
Yeah. Yeah, getting the ending of the pâte à choux is just one of those feels. It's like you finish it and then you kind of come back a little bit. It's like you come back and you scrape the tip of the pastry tip just a little bit against the surface. So it's coming back and then you kind of go like this, back and then this. But again, it's one of those things. I probably did hundreds of trays of, you know, pâte à choux before it was just like, okay, let's get the next tray done. And then it just starts flowing. So you're just practicing here. Eventually, you know, as you do it more and more. Thanks, Jen.
Okay.
Marlon is up next.
So the question that I have is like for presentation wise, why would you not want to cover, I know it's on the bottom, but like say if you were to fill a pâte de choux from the top, why wouldn't you want to like cover it with the ganache so that way there's no hole in the bottom? Like, so there's pastry cream on the plate? I don't know.
Well, if you do it correctly, you shouldn't be getting much pastry cream on the plate. I mean, the filling should be completely on the inside, and sometimes you know you want to scrape it off a little bit. Oftentimes, you often see it done from the back end too. It's not always the bottom. So sometimes you're filling it in from the side, the small side, rather than the bottom. So there's just different techniques, different ways of doing it.
Okay.
Nakia?
Hello.
Hi.
I just wanted to mention that I found that my scale that was sent to me in our package does not work very well. And I had some issues with measurement. And then once I was able to get another scale, it worked a lot better for me. So I don't know if other people are having that issue. And maybe that's why their pâte de choux didn't come out the greatest.
Are you using the Ascali scale? Was that the one that you got? Was the Ascali one?
Not sure. It's a little, yeah, it's like a little gray digital one.
Yeah, it might be the Ascali one. Okay, well, I'll make a note of that, and I'll let student services know. I think that oftentimes they send different scales to different students. I assume it's probably what's available. They probably buy them in bulk. So certain groups might have one, other students might have others.
Right.
So if you can get me the information or your chef, we can write it down and then try to make a note of it with student services.
Alrighty. I know that, and I originally realized it didn't work when I put the bowl on, zeroed it out, and I add stuff to it, and it stayed at 0.
So, I mean, that could be an issue
Yeah.
that people are running into with scale. So it's great that you bring that up. But I think some of the issues that I see across the board are measuring issues. And people, again, might be thinking they're doing it properly. It could be a scale issue running into it. But I think it could just be a measuring issue. So it's good to know that your products are coming out better now with a scale. About what scale were you able to buy? Just curious.
I didn't buy one. Actually, I had a friend
give
me a little, I don't even know if it's a kitchen scale really, but give me one to borrow.
Okay.
So I don't actually have one right now, but I did borrow one.
Okay. One that I've used for a while that I've, for years and years is the OXO scale. I've really liked those, and you can find them on Amazon, Best Buy and Beyond, a bunch of different places. I've been very, very happy with my OXO scales. So,
alriady.
And I use scales all the time. I mean, I scale out my coffee in the morning. I'm drinking coffee, so.
Interesting. Okay.
16 grams to 310 grams of water. That's how I make my coffees. That's
great.
All right, Sherrod.
How you doing, Chef? I had an issue with my pastry cream. I think my my cornstarch thickened in like chunks when I was stirring it. So yeah, when it was cooking down, I think it cooked it too far.
Right. So you know the Michael Jackson song "Beat It." That's what you want to do. You got to beat it.
And that's because it went in the video. It was saying use the wooden spoon, and I was like, that is not working. I had to pull out the whisk and.
Yeah. So my recommendation whenever I make pastry cream, because you're taking your eggs and your sugar. You're then taking your hot liquid, you're tempering it in there. So literally the temperature of your liquid is pretty close to the temperature that you want to reach at. So when you put that back in the pot, it's going to start gelatinizing. That starch is going to start swelling, absorbing moisture super, super fast because cornstarch gelatinizes at 205 degrees. So if you're not whisking and getting that corner and keeping those gelatinizing starches kind of in motion and absorbing water evenly, you're going to get those clumps. Now, two things you can do. If you start getting those clumps, make sure you turn the heat down, whisk, 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 whisk. When you're finished, have a strainer or some sort of sieve, a conical strainer, whatever you have, over a bowl and go ahead and strain it out. That will hopefully get rid of the chunks that if they just form. If it gets to the point where you take it off and it's super chunky, you might have to redo it again just simply because there's too much starch. But again, key, when you put that tempered liquid back into the pot, sing Michael Jackson there and, use your whisk. I know you can do it with a spoon. I find more success with the whisk personally.
Yeah, lesson learned. Use the whisk next time.
Good question though. Barbara?
I had two things. One was that I've never had empanadas before, so I know from what I'm understanding, it has some savory and it has some hot because of the peppers. Is it okay to pair it with something a little sweet too, or would that probably not be a good idea?
You mean as an accompaniment that to eat it with, or are you thinking about a different filling? I'm not sure about what you're.
Accompanying it to eat it with, like a sweet sauce or something like that.
Well, the salsa verde is, I mean, it is a little sweet. I mean, there is some jalapeno in there. I mean, the other night when I made this, we did rice. I had some chicken that we made, and I think we had a salad as well. So, and we didn't do anything sweet with it. And my younger son is not very, doesn't like a lot of hot things, and he was fine with this. I mean, I think he ate like 3 or 4 of them. So it wasn't too spicy for him, and I know that he's heat adverse. You know, there's a bunch of cheese in there. The cheese helps mitigate a little bit of the spiciness. Sometimes poblano peppers are a tiny bit spicy. They aren't, you know, super spicy. I would call them more flavorful than spicy. You know, if you don't want to put the jalapeno or a very small or less amount of jalapeno in your salsa verde, you can do it that way.
Yeah, I have 2 little young daughters, so I was kind of worried about the spice. Also, my husband previously worked at Dairy Queen, and he said even though he had been there for 2 years, he still couldn't get the swirl down. That the manager who had been there for 6 years was the only one who could do it perfectly.
That piping eventually gets like that. It's like you learn it, and then you get the feel and touch for it. And I think it's one of those things that you don't think about when you're doing it because you just kind of get into doing it. I think if you think about it, then you become more tentative. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's kind of like Michael Jordan when he used to play basketball in the zone and he was hitting those 3 shots. He said he wasn't even thinking about it. He was just doing it. Chef Jen, do you have anything to add before we stop the session and then go over to answer any questions?
Just one thing. Remember that egg wash gives it that beautiful shine. It's going to make it look less dry, and it's going to give you a really nice color. And I've gotten a lot of questions about that in the chat tonight. So yes, egg wash, egg wash, egg wash. And then what I do is I take 1 egg, I add about a teaspoon of a water to it and whisk it together, and that's what I use for my egg wash. Other than that, I say if you're ready to close it out, I will let you do that, and then we can stay after and answer some questions.
Yeah, so we're going to stay. I'm going to stop the recording, and there you go. And now we're